Jason stepped outside, heart pounding. His cherry-red Mustang was gone. No note, no warning, just an empty driveway staring back at him like a nightmare. The HOA had seized it overnight, wielding power like a weapon. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. 1. Jason stood on the cracked concrete of his driveway, eyes scanning the empty space where the cherry-red Mustang had been just hours before. The morning sun was already climbing, but its warmth did little to thaw the cold pit forming in his stomach. His hands clenched into fists, nails biting into his palms, as a tight knot of disbelief and fury twisted inside him. This wasn't just a car. It was years of sweat and sacrifice. The midnight oil burned to polish rusted bolts back to gleaming chrome, and the painstaking nights spent hunched under the hood with grease-stained fingers tracing the familiar contours of the engine. It was every lesson his father had ever taught him, whispered over an engine block decades ago. Every memory of laughter and stern advice echoed in every rev of the motor. But now that legacy was ripped from him by an unyielding bureaucracy cloaked in self-righteousness. The Homeowners Association had towed it. No warning, no note, just vanished. The raw insult was undeniable. The Mustang wasn't some rusting eyesore or abandoned relic. It was meticulously maintained, a shining beacon of pride in a neighborhood where conformity was the currency. Jason's neighbors drove their beige sedans, SUVs, and bland economy cars without question, but his Mustang was a glaring anomaly. And that anomaly had become a target. Evelyn Grant. The name churned in his mind like a venomous chant. She was the iron fist of Willow Creek's HOA, a woman whose smile was as sharp as her rulebook, wielding regulations like weapons designed to crush any spark of individuality. Her latest edict, the so-called community aesthetic policy, was a vague catch-all meant to suffocate dissent under the guise of neighborhood harmony. But everyone knew the real reason was control, pure and simple. Evelyn didn't tolerate those who challenged her dominion, and Jason, with his rebellious streak and the glaring symbol of his independence, had crossed an invisible line. The hypocrisy gnawed at him. The neighbors' cars were all parked haphazardly, some leaking oil, others cluttered with personal effects, junk that should have been the real concern. Yet their vehicles remained untouched. Only his Mustang, gleaming like a defiant scarlet beacon, was deemed unacceptable. It wasn't about rules, it was about power, and Jason was the perfect pawn in Evelyn's game to demonstrate who called the shots. His mind raced through the conversations he'd had with neighbors, hushed sympathies, quiet nods of understanding, but no one willing to openly oppose the board for fear of their own fragile peace. The isolation was suffocating. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where the echoes of his father's lessons could live on in the quiet hum of a restored engine. Instead, it was a battleground, and he was outgunned. The legal notices Evelyn had sent were cold, impersonal, and threatening. The towing fees piled up like a ransom demand, each dollar a cruel reminder that reclaiming what was his came at a cost. But to Jason, the Mustang wasn't a possession. It was identity, heritage, baggage, blood, and grit welded into steel and rubber. It was the only piece of his father he could hold on to in a world that had relentlessly tried to wash away the past. Anger burned like gasoline in his veins, but beneath the fury was a more dangerous seed: desperation. The idea of surrendering to the HOA's demands was unthinkable. Yet the crushing reality of mounting fees and legal threats left him cornered, a man forced to choose between his pride and the crushing weight of compliance. Every moment spent staring at that empty driveway tightened the noose around his resolve. The car wasn't just missing, it was stolen from him by a faceless authority that didn't care about heritage, passion, or the stories forged in the glow of a workshop's fluorescent light. Evelyn had made her move, drawing the line in the sand. Now, Jason knew that getting his Mustang back wouldn't be a simple transaction. It would require a reckoning. The quiet streets of Willow Creek, so often a backdrop of suburban monotony, suddenly felt hostile, alien. The pristine lawns and symmetrical mailboxes masked an undercurrent of silent compliance, the community's collective surrender to a tyranny masquerading as order. Jason wasn't just fighting for a car, he was battling the erasure of something vital, something fiercely personal. His thoughts shifted to the countless nights spent in the garage, the oil stains on his hands, the hum of the engine that never failed to steady his restless mind. That Mustang was more than metal and paint. It was the last tether to a past he refused to let slip away. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood, Jason's mind sharpened with resolve. The outrage was just the beginning. The fight for his Mustang and for his dignity was far from over. Weeks later, Jason sat hunched over the cramped desk inside the tow yard's cramped office, the flickering fluorescent light casting sharp shadows across the peeling paint and stained paperwork stacked in chaotic piles. His eyes burned from hours of poring over invoices, legal notices, and contracts that threatened to suffocate him under their bureaucratic weight. The toll of the past weeks pressed on his chest like an anchor. But amid the oppressive paperwork and gnawing frustration, he noticed an irregularity that stoked a cautious ember of hope. The tow yard's business was unraveling. The owner, a grizzled man named Carl, who'd run the yard for decades, was clearly worn down by the grind. Jason had caught Carl's offhand remarks about retirement during their terse conversations, a slow slide into exhaustion, a desire to pass the torch before the world crushed him completely. The yard's clientele had shrunk, fewer cars came in, fewer fees paid. A business on the brink, vulnerable and desperate. That vulnerability carved a crack in the wall of Jason's despair. A reckless idea blossomed, wild and daring, unpolished but tantalizing in its audacity. What if he didn't just retrieve his Mustang by paying ransom fees, but instead took control of the very system that had snatched it away? What if he bought the tow yard itself? The thought consumed him. Ownership meant power. The power to decide what was towed, when, and why. It was a chance to protect not just himself, but others who had suffered under the cold decree of the HOA and its iron rule. This wasn't mere revenge anymore. It was a strategic strike to rebalance a corrupted system, to inject fairness into a mechanism built on fear and compliance. His days blurred into nights spent researching zoning laws, financing options, and the tangled legal landscape surrounding such a business. Every call was a calculated move. Every meeting with Carl and potential lenders an exercise in persuasion. Jason's grit, honed through years of wrenching stubborn engines back to life, now fueled negotiations that felt like battles. He understood engines better than contracts, but he refused to be outmatched. Neighbors began to notice the change in him. Whispers in the cul-de-sac, furtive conversations over hedges and backyard fences slowly grew into quiet support. Many had suffered in silence under the HOA's iron grip, feeling trapped and isolated. Yet Jason's defiance sparked something new, a flicker of collective courage. He wasn't just a man chasing a car anymore. He was becoming a symbol of resistance. Maria, a single mother whose aging sedan had been threatened with tow for a cracked bumper, approached him cautiously one afternoon. "If you pull this off," she said softly, "maybe we'll all finally have a voice." The weight of responsibility settled on Jason's shoulders, heavier than any engine he'd ever lifted. But with it came clarity. This was no longer just about a Mustang or a stubborn boardwoman's whims. This was about reclaiming agency, rewriting the rules from within. Against the odds, the pieces fell into place faster than anyone expected. Carl, weary and eager to escape the relentless grind, agreed to terms that surprised both men. Local lenders, seeing the neighborhood rally behind Jason, loosened their grips on financing. The HOA board, blindsided and scrambling, found their grip slipping even before the deal was finalized. When the purchase was complete, Jason stood on the office steps of the tow yard, the crisp air filling his lungs with a taste of hard-won victory. The yard's faded sign now bore his name alongside Carl's as a reminder of the passing of the torch. Evelyn's steely gaze from across the street was a quiet admission. The game had changed. The community's eyes, long dulled by resignation, now shone with a tentative hope. They watched Jason not as a troublemaker, but as a champion for fairness, a man who had turned loss into leverage. The spark that had ignited in a cramped office, amid piles of bills and faded contracts, had grown into a flame that promised change. Jason's vision extended beyond mere ownership. He imagined a tow yard that was a safeguard, a watchdog standing between the HOA's unchecked power and the neighbors' freedom. The fight was far from over, but the tide had shifted. In that moment, Jason felt the fierce pulse of possibility, not just for himself, but for all of Willow Creek. Jason stood behind the counter of the tow yard office, his hands resting firmly on the chipped wood surface, eyes scanning the ledger filled with meticulously logged entries, every vehicle towed, every fee charged, every community complaint addressed with unprecedented transparency. Under his control, the yard transformed from a cold, anonymous instrument of power into a beacon of fairness. Gone were the days when cars vanished overnight, victims of arbitrary whims cloaked in vague rules. Now, every action had to be justified. Every tow was subject to clear standards, publicly posted and explained. He made certain that no resident could be blindsided or silenced again. The neighbors, long simmering with frustration under the HOA's iron fist, found a new sense of empowerment. They gathered regularly at the tow yard, once a place they feared, to discuss grievances, propose improvements, and share stories of past injustices. Their voices, once stifled by intimidation, swelled in strength and volume. The oppressive silence imposed by Evelyn Grant and her board cracked under the weight of collective resolve. People who had once accepted eviction notices, fines, and threats with resignation now demanded accountability. Jason's leadership became the catalyst for this shift, a rallying point for a community reclaiming its dignity. Evelyn, watching from her austere office in the HOA building, seethed. The power she had wielded with ruthless precision slipped through her fingers like sand. Her attempts to claw back control became desperate and reckless. Legal challenges flooded the neighborhood, cease and desist letters, injunctions, veiled threats to the tow yard's new policies. She tried to intimidate residents supporting Jason, sending official warnings and employing aggressive legalese designed to sow fear and confusion. But Jason was ready. He anticipated every move, backed by a growing network of lawyers, journalists, and advocates who scrutinized the HOA's every action. Behind the scenes, Jason compiled damning evidence of the HOA's violations. Documents showing selective enforcement of rules, financial records revealing misappropriation of community funds, testimonies from neighbors who had been harassed or unfairly penalized. This trove of proof became the cornerstone of a broader campaign to expose corruption. Jason invited reporters from the local newspaper and TV stations to the tow yard, opening its gates for public tours that contrasted the yard's newfound integrity with the HOA's shadowy governance. The pressure mounted until it became impossible to ignore. One evening, the local news broadcast aired a segment that sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. Footage of Jason speaking passionately about fairness and justice, interviews with neighbors who had suffered, and excerpts from official documents that laid bare the HOA's malpractices. At the heart of the broadcast was Evelyn, confronted on camera by the community's outrage, forced to acknowledge her board's errors and abuses. Her composed facade fractured under the spotlight, her words stumbling as the weight of public scrutiny pressed down. Within days, her resignation came as a quiet but unmistakable admission of defeat. Jason watched the broadcast from his modest living room, the glow of the television reflecting off the polished chrome of his cherry-red Mustang parked in the driveway outside. The car gleamed in the fading light, untouched and untouchable, a symbol not just of personal pride, but of victory against oppression. Neighbors passed by, nodding with quiet respect. The yard, once a place of fear, now hummed with the energy of a community united. This triumph was no fleeting moment. It ignited a broader awakening within Willow Creek. Residents began attending HOA meetings in numbers never before seen, demanding transparency and democratic participation. Policies were rewritten, committees formed, and an atmosphere of collaboration replaced the old regime's authoritarian rule. Jason's stand inspired others to question unfair systems in their own lives, proving that courage and determination could dismantle even the most entrenched injustice. In the end, Jason Miller did more than reclaim a car. He reclaimed his neighborhood's soul, turning loss and humiliation into a victory that resonated far beyond the driveway of a single 1967 Mustang. His story became a beacon, a testament that no injustice, no matter how crushing, should ever be accepted in silence, and that even the smallest fight, when fought with unyielding resolve, can end in a triumph sweet enough to echo for generations.